distinguished guests. You know, on a Friday night, I know you have other things to be doing than to sit here listening to me and Jack talk politics. It's true. Jack and I are politicians. What do you want? It's not the most respected profession these days. We're involved in politics, we talk politics, but Jacques and I, we're not naive. Not naive. We know that there are many among you. You view politicians like as people who are a little bit cynical, don't always tell the truth. They make great promises that aren't always realized. What does that mean? That means that the population is cynical and disillusioned by some politicians. I can tell you that the people of Quebec and of Canada have good reason to be disillusioned by politicians. Because often in their speeches, and this wasn't the case in Jacques' speech, politicians exaggerate their merits, and they also denigrate their opposition. They claim that they can fix everything with a new law, a new regulation, a new program. Well, I try to do politics differently. To say true things, to not make promises, to do my best to represent well the people of Beauce and Quebec in Ottawa, like all my conservative colleagues and the candidates who stand for our party. But to the people, it seems that from one government to another, from one elected official to another, they have the impression that nothing ever changes, even that things are getting worse. That's why tonight I've decided not to give you a traditional political speech, but instead to do a speech on the problems of politics today. And politics, I believe, is much more interesting when you're interested in the intelligence of people and you don't make speeches to arouse their emotions and their sense of partisanship. But let's turn to the real problems of politics tonight. Why do we think that things aren't changing, or maybe even that they're getting worse in Quebec? Despite economic growth, despite the advantages of modern life. Is it a false impression? Is it a false feeling that we have? If you look at certain historical tendencies, you could conclude that it's not a false impression, that it's actually a very well-founded impression. The principal tendency that we observe is that government all over the world does not stop growing. What is a big government? Well, it's a government that spends more, a government that taxes more, a government that borrows more, a government that is more in debt, a government that regulates everything that moves. Above all, it's a government that intervenes in all aspects of our everyday life and that reduces especially our liberty as citizens to act. That's what happens. What's happened all over the world in the 20th century. The role, the scale, the power of a government has not stopped growing. And to put it in more concrete terms, well, there are economic statistics that demonstrate this very well. For example, the measure of public spending of all countries, not just in Canada, in terms of GDP, that means the portion of the total economy that is controlled by the government. In the main countries of the Western world, it was at 10% 100 years ago. But today, the part of the economy controlled by the government is more than 40%. So it's almost the majority of the entire economy that's controlled by the government. The majority of your salary is going toward taxes. So you work almost 6 months a year to finance the spending of municipal, provincial, and federal governments. And what's more, and what's even more disappointing, is that even all the taxes that we pay, that represents almost the majority of your salary, is not even sufficient to pay for all the programs of our huge interventionist government. Governments have to borrow billions every year to make up for their deficits. There might be some among you who are going to have children, among the younger of you, or some who already have children, but know that each newborn is born with a debt of more than $15,000, a debt that must be repaid over the course of their lives. Maybe that's why babies cry when they're born. Public spending and taxes that governments go after does not explain on its own why government is so big. There has to be something else at play. And what that is regulation, excessive regulation. A few years ago at the Montreal Economic Institute, I was vice president of the institute at the time. We did a study that demonstrated that the government of Quebec adds 8,000 pages of new laws and new regulations every year, while the federal government adds 2,000 pages. And very few of these new rules that are adopted every year are abolished, even if they're out of date. And at the same time, every year we continue to adopt more and more regulations. What does that mean? It means that we have a society that is more regulated like it never was 10, 20, 30, 100 years ago. I don't want to depress anyone here tonight, but think simply of all the permissions and all the taxes that you have to pay to drive a car, your driver's license, the gas taxes, fees, and there are certainly other examples that come to mind where you have to ask the permission of the government. If there are any hunters here in the room tonight, well, the questions that you have to answer just to obtain the right to use your rifle to go hunting, questions about your private life. The state asks whether you've had a heartbreak. The state asks plenty of other questions just to have the right to go hunting. The state treats hunters, all hunters, like potential criminals. You can do practically nothing today without asking the permission of a bureaucrat. You want to drive a boat? Yeah, a boat. Or an ATV? Well, you better arm yourself with the patience to obtain the necessary authorization. And you'd better know all the rules that apply. Even though there are thousands of regulations that are usually written in language that is difficult to understand, obscure regulations, not knowing them is not an excuse in the eyes of the law to break the rules. That means you cannot plead ignorance of the law. Governments take us too often for irresponsible children and believe that they know better than us what is good for us. For them, it justifies the measures that they adopt, taking us by the hand, telling us what to do from cradle to grave, and also taking our money from our pockets. So, sometimes I like to have a beer with you, but did you know that in Quebec there is a law that imposes a minimum price for the beer that you buy in the store? Yeah. Beer could be cheaper, but the government is afraid that you would drink more if the price is lower. So, the alcohol policy of Quebec determines a minimum price that vendors can sell beer for in order to not encourage a consumption, and I am quoting the law, an irresponsible consumption. It's not a joke. It's reality. It's written like that in the law. The government does not want to encourage irresponsible consumption. The government considers that you're incapable of controlling yourself and of consuming responsibly if the price of beer were lower. Well, that's done well for the government. The higher the price, the more taxes that they can go after to put in their coffers. Governments, as you have noticed, want to protect us from all the dangers and all the risks of everyday life. How do they do that? By controlling us, by controlling our actions. And I have a question for you. If the government wants to protect us from all the dangers that exist, who's going to protect us from the government? Governments control parts of the overall economy, 40% or more, but they also control entire sectors of the economy like healthcare and education, sectors that are constantly in financial crisis and that always have problems. But every year, the budgets of these programs, the budgets of healthcare and education, never fail to keep growing at a rate greater than that of the growth of the economy. We can ask ourselves, how is all this possible? I will quote the former American president, Ronald Reagan, who very well explained the point of view of big interventionist governments. He said it like this: if something moves, tax it. If it continues to move, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it. That's how it is. It's like that in Canada. It's like that in all developed countries of the world. But it has to be asked, why did the size of government grow so much in 100 years? Did everyone here really want to have a big interventionist government? Is that what you voted for? No. Economists have attempted to explain the situation. Why, despite the fact that individual citizens don't vote to have a big interventionist government that intervenes in their life every day and treats them like children, why does it continue to grow year after year? It's very simple. There are certain interest groups that are strongly interested in organizing for their political passions. What do these pressure groups want? They want protectionist measures to help themselves. They want more generous social programs that you're going to have to pay for. They want fiscal or legal privileges. They want regulation that would be favorable to them. And they want regulation to protect them from competition. Why? Because a favor from government could bring them considerable benefits. Of course. It's you, the citizens, who are going to have to pay the bill. But in your case, the amount that you'd have to pay for each specific measure is not enough to justify to organize against it and oppose it. You don't have the time. You don't have the time to go to meetings and to organize marches in the streets to denounce specific measures of the government that are going to cost you $10. But $10 here, $10 there, that adds up to thousands and thousands of dollars. You have to work and you have to look after your family. On the other hand, the lobby receiving $100 million thanks to a specific measure of a government has a huge interest in organizing and to put pressure on politicians. So it's very difficult for politicians to say no to these lobbies. Why? Well, these lobbies have the means to influence the debate, to rapidly mobilize supporters, and to elicit controversy in the media. On the other hand, you never hear anyone talking about the silent majority, you, who are going to have to pay the bill. Then, all that coupled with the public servants working within the government, public servants are looking for higher salaries, just like all of us, and other advantages. And that's normal. That's life. But public servants aren't saints devoted to the public good. They have their own interests to defend as well. Their interests? What are they? To get a promotion? How to get a promotion? Grow the program that you administer, have a bigger budget, and have more important power. Those public servants have a great influence on political decision making because it's them who control the information and control the agenda of the politicians. I'm telling you this as a result of my personal experiences as Minister of Industry. I wanted to achieve a goal, and I succeeded at achieving it, and that was an important deregulation of the telecommunications sector, with the goal of allowing more competition, more choice, and lower prices for consumers. But let me tell you that I had to go to battle against my own public servants to realize this reform, because it was not to their advantage to have less regulation, less power for public servants. That's not what they want, like I just said. And if these interest groups and the public servants want a bigger and more interventionist government, and the politicians accept, then you, the electors, you're going to have more government, whether you like it or not. And that is how the state grows and continues to grow, and that's how we're becoming less and less free and more dependent on the government. The question that we have to ask ourselves is, what can we do? What can you do to reverse this tendency? First, what I ask is that you have a good understanding of this dynamic that I just explained, and a good understanding that the biggest division in politics is between one side, who wants more state, more programs, more government, more control, more taxes, and the other side, who want to leave people alone and free and responsible for their own actions. And if you're part of the second category, what can you do? I say, demand that the government get out of your way. Tell your elected representatives that you want more freedom. Tell them that you want to be treated like responsible adults. Speak up. Speak up loudly to your friends, your parents, your neighbors. Because the more people there are who understand these ideas and who share these ideas, the easier it will be, the more possible it will be to create a counterbalance against this lobby that we hear constantly, and you know we hear them constantly in the media, who want more intervention of the government and more of your money. And of course, politicians have also taken advantage at the expense of the silent majority. That means your interests. And in conclusion, well, it's true. People tell me often that it seems that politics is a little annoying, and it degenerates often into political mudslinging. But if you don't pay attention to politics, politics will pay attention to you, and always to your wallet. So the message that I have for you tonight is that it's up to you to decide if we're going to have a more free society, a more prosperous, more responsible society, and together we can do it to live in a society that is more free and more responsible, that treats adults like adults and not like irresponsible children who require regulation of all their activities all the time. So it's up to you, and our future is a future that you see, that you wish for, that you demand. It's to work for you, for your future, for your happiness, for your freedom, and doing that, you will create a society that's more free and more responsible. Thank you. Good night.